The morning fog lay thick over the hedgerows south of Akramville, clinging to the earthen walls like something alive and malevolent. Mason O'Reilly pressed himself flat against the muddy embankment, tasting dirt and rotted roots with every shallow breath. His hands trembled, not from fear, though God knew there was plenty of that, but from the cold that had seeped through his uniform during the night. June in Normandy, and still he couldn't stop shaking. It was Or's 6:12 hours on the 14th of June, 1944, and the MG-34 positioned 200 meters ahead had been killing Americans for 20 minutes straight. The German machine gun sat behind a bunker that seemed to have grown organically from the hedgerow itself, a cancer of earth and timber that commanded the entire approach. Mason had watched 11 men from his company try to cross that field. He'd watched the grass turn red in patches, watched bodies twist and fall in the peculiar boneless way that dead men do. The last one, a kid from Nebraska whose name Mason couldn't remember, had made it almost 15 meters before the gun found him. The burst that killed him had been surgical, professional, 5 rounds that painted the morning mist with pink vapor. The MG-34 fired in patterns. Mason had been counting. 6 to 8 seconds of silence, then a 3-second burst that swept left to right across the killing field. Then another pause. The German crew knew their business. They weren't panicking, weren't wasting ammunition. They were executing, in both senses of the word. Every pattern was calculated to catch anyone who thought they'd found the rhythm, anyone who believed they could time their rush between the bursts. Mason's eyes traced the bunker's construction, and something in his brain, something forged in 5 years of loading cargo on Baltimore's docks, began to whisper. The bunker was dug deep, its firing slit barely 2 feet above ground level. The roof was thick with packed earth, easily 3 feet of Normandy clay that had turned aside every artillery shell the battalion had thrown at it. But supporting that roof, visible now in the growing light, were 2 timber beams. Just 2. They rose at angles from the bunker's interior, propping up what had to be several tons of wet earth. And those beams were wrong. Mason squinted through the haze, his dock worker's eye reading the structure the way other men read books. The left beam showed a dark stain halfway up its length. Rot, probably. Or at least water damage from the rains that had pounded this godforsaken country for 3 days straight. The right beam sat at an angle that was just slightly off, as if whoever had built this position had been in a hurry, or hadn't cared, or simply didn't know that weight distribution mattered. Back home, Mason had seen a warehouse wall come down because someone had removed the wrong support post. 3 men had died under falling crates of engine parts. He remembered the sound, timber cracking, then that awful silence before the collapse, then screaming. O'Reilly. Sergeant Hale's voice was a rasp beside him. The sergeant had taken shrapnel in his left arm an hour ago, and his face had the gray pallor of a man losing blood. But his eyes were still sharp, still watching his boys the way he'd always watched them. "You see something?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it. What was he going to say? That he thought he could collapse a German bunker using dock loading techniques? That 5 years of stacking cargo containers had given him insight into Wehrmacht engineering? It sounded insane even in his own head. Maybe, he managed, those support beams. They're not right. Hale turned his head slowly, conserving energy, and followed Mason's gaze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "You worked construction?" "Dock loading, Baltimore port, similar principles." The MG-34 hammered out another burst, and both men pressed themselves deeper into the mud. Somewhere to their left, someone was crying softly, steadily. The kind of crying that meant shock, or a gut wound, or both. The radio operator had been trying to raise battalion for 30 minutes, but all they got was static and occasionally a fragment of conversation from some other unit, somewhere else in this maze of hedgerows. They were alone. The Shermans that were supposed to support them were bogged down in a drainage ditch 300 meters back, their crews frantically trying to winch themselves free, while German observers called in mortar coordinates. "Command says, hold position," Hale said quietly. "Wait for armor support." "Armor's not coming." That was PFC, Torres crawling up from behind with his rifle slung awkwardly across his back. The private first class was a mechanic from Texas, lean and dark with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. Heard it on the radio before it died. Germans got a PAC-40 in the orchard. Knocked out 2 Shermans already. Nobody's moving until they deal with that. Then we're stuck, Hale said. He wasn't asking. We're stuck, Torres confirmed. He settled into the mud beside them, breathing hard. Lost radio contact 20 minutes ago. Battalion thinks we're already past this position. Nobody's coming. Mason's eyes hadn't left the bunker. In his mind, he was back in Baltimore, back in the cargo terminal, where he'd spent his days calculating weight and balance and stress points. He'd had a gift for it, his foreman had said. Could look at a stack of crates and know instinctively which one you could pull without bringing the whole pile down. It was about leverage, about finding the keystone, about understanding that every structure, no matter how solid it looked, had a point of failure. This bunker had a point of failure. Those beams were it. I might have an idea, Mason said slowly. But it's crazy. Hale turned to look at him fully now. Blood had soaked through the bandage on his arm, dripping slow and dark into the mud. Son, we're pinned down by a machine gun that's killed 11 of our people. We've got no radio, no support, and the Germans probably know exactly where we are. Crazy is about all we've got left. Mason took a breath that tasted like cordite and death. Those support beams, if we can put enough weight on them at the right angle, or pull them out, the whole roof comes down. The machine gun crew gets buried, or at least buried enough to stop shooting. Torres stared at him. You want to collapse the bunker on top of them? I want to use their own fortification to kill them, Mason said. No explosives, no direct assault, just gravity and poor engineering. That's the craziest goddamn thing I've ever heard, Torres said. But he didn't say no. Hale was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. Walk me through it. Mason's mind raced, translating dock floor experience into battlefield application. We need weight and leverage. See that right side beam? It's taking most of the load because the left one's compromised by rot. If we can add weight to the edge of the roof, maybe 50, 60 pounds, and then pull that right beam out from under, the whole structure becomes unstable. Pull it with what? Torres asked. Mason patted the coil of steel cable he'd been carrying since D-Day, scavenged from a destroyed landing craft. Old habits died hard, and dock workers knew that cable could solve almost any problem. This, we loop it around the beam, then on my signal, we pull. Hard. And how do we add weight to the roof? Hale asked. Ammo boxes. Fill them with rocks, mud, whatever we can find. Place them on the edge of the roof, right over where the beam connects. When we pull the beam, the weight shifts and Mason made a downward motion with his hand. Collapse. You've done this before? Torres asked. I've seen what happens when you remove the wrong support, Mason said quietly. Killed 3 men in my warehouse. I know how structures fail. The MG-34 spoke again, a long burst this time, tearing up the hedge to their right where someone had been moving. The firing pattern was changing. The Germans were getting nervous, spraying more rounds. That meant they knew the Americans were still here, still alive, still a threat. But it also meant they were burning through ammunition. Timing's everything, Mason continued. That MG has a rhythm, 8 seconds quiet, 3 seconds firing. We need to move during the quiet periods. No mistakes. One person makes noise. We're all dead. I'll come with you, Torres said immediately. No, Hale cut in. You're wounded, Torres. That leg's worse than you're letting on. It's fine. That's an order. Hale's voice had steel in it, despite the blood loss. O'Reilly, you need someone who can move quiet and pull hard. That's me. Mason looked at the sergeant's gray face, the blood-soaked bandage. Sarge, you're still breathing, still moving, and I'm not letting you go out there alone. Hale checked his rifle, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his body was failing him, but refused to acknowledge it. Besides, I pulled you out from under that pallet back in Baltimore when we were loading for the crossing. Remember? You owe me. Mason did remember. A cargo pallet had shifted during loading, and Hale, then just another dock worker before they both enlisted, had yanked him clear before 2 tons of equipment could crush him. That had been another life, another world. A world where the worst thing that could happen was an industrial accident, not a machine gun burst through your chest. I remember, Mason said quietly. Then let's go settle that debt. They gathered what they needed in grim silence. 3 empty ammunition boxes, which Torres filled with mud and rocks until each weighed close to 20 pounds. Mason's steel cable, 60 feet of it, enough to loop around the beam and still have length to pull from cover. A pair of combat knives to dig with if needed. And time, they'd need time and luck, and the Germans would need to keep following their pattern. The approach to the bunker was 70 meters of open ground, then 20 meters of drainage ditch, then a final 10 meters of exposed earth before they'd reach the structure itself. Mason and Hale would have to crawl the entire distance, moving only during the 8-second pauses, freezing when the gun spoke, 3 boxes to carry, plus the cable. It would take multiple trips, or perfect coordination. Torres, Hale said, gripping the younger man's shoulder, when we make the pull, I need you to open up with everything you've got. Make them think we're launching an assault from this side. Keep their attention on you, not on us. I can do that? Torres checked his M1 Garand, his face set. How will I know when? You'll hear the collapse, Mason said. Trust me, you'll hear it. They waited for the pattern. 8 seconds of silence. The world held its breath. Mason could hear his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears like artillery. Could feel every grain of mud against his skin, smell the copper tang of blood mixed with cordite. 3 seconds of firing, the MG-34's distinctive sound like cloth being ripped, fast and mechanical and utterly without mercy. Then silence again. Now, Hale whispered. They moved. Mason had never moved so slowly in his life. Every motion was calculated, every placement of hand and knee a negotiation with the earth beneath him. The first ammunition box felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the straps cutting into his shoulders. Hale moved beside him, one-handed, his wounded arm held tight against his chest. They had 8 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They froze, pressing themselves flat, becoming part of the earth. The MG-34 fired. Mason felt the displacement of air as rounds passed overhead, snapping through the space where they had been seconds before. One round hit the ground 5 feet to his left, kicking up a spray of mud that spattered across his face. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited, counting the seconds until the gun fell silent again. They moved. Another 6 feet gained. The drainage ditch was still 40 meters away. Mason's arms burned, his back screamed. The ammunition box felt like it was dragging him backward, pulling him into the earth. He could see Hale's face beside him, white except for the mud and blood, lips pulled back in a grimace of effort. 8 seconds, 3 seconds, 8 seconds, 3 seconds. The rhythm became everything. The world narrowed to those intervals, those precious moments of silence when movement meant life and stillness meant death. Mason lost track of time. Minutes could have been hours. The drainage ditch grew closer with agonizing slowness. Someone was still crying somewhere behind them, the sound thin and distant now. The MG-34 just kept firing, patient and methodical and inevitable. Mason's hand came down on something soft and yielding. He looked down and found himself staring into the sightless eyes of the kid from Nebraska. The boy's mouth was open in a small "oh" of surprise, as if death had found him while he was asking a question. His uniform was soaked black with blood. Mason jerked his hand away, swallowing back bile, and kept crawling. They reached the drainage ditch after what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes. The ditch was half full of muddy water that stank of decay and chemicals. They slid into it, gasping, and for a moment just lay there in the filth, letting their hearts slow. Mason's hands were raw, bleeding in places where the cable had cut through his gloves. Hale's face was the color of old newsprint. "We're not even halfway," the sergeant panted. "I know. Those boys are counting on us. I know." They rested for 30 seconds, which was all the time mercy would allow. Then they started again, hauling the ammunition boxes up the far side of the ditch, preparing for the final approach. From here, the bunker was close enough to see in detail. Mason could make out the logs and sandbags that framed the firing slit, the way the earth mounded over the top like a burial cairn, and those beams, still visible, still wrong, still waiting to betray the men who trusted them. The second trip was harder. They went back for the remaining boxes and the cable, and this time the Germans changed their pattern. Maybe they'd seen movement, maybe they were just being cautious. But now the silences were shorter, 6 seconds instead of 8, and the bursts were longer. Mason felt a round tug at his jacket, felt the heat of it pass through the fabric without quite touching skin. Hale grunted once, a sound of pain quickly suppressed, and Mason knew he'd been hit again. But the sergeant kept moving, kept crawling, kept dragging his burden through the mud. By the time they'd positioned all 3 boxes at the edge of the bunker's roof, right where Mason's experience told him the weight would matter most, the sun was higher and the fog was burning off. That was bad. Less concealment. But it also meant Mason could see the beam more clearly, could trace its angle, could confirm what his instincts had told him. This structure was an accident waiting to happen. The cable was the hardest part. They had to get it around the beam, which meant Mason had to crawl right up to the bunker's side, work his way along the earthen wall until he could reach into the gap where the beam met the structure. His hands were numb now, clumsy with cold and fear. The cable slipped twice. He could hear German voices inside the bunker, muffled but distinct. Someone was reloading. Someone else was speaking rapidly, urgently. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't know what. Mason got the cable looped and secured. He used a dock hitch, the same knot he'd tied 10,000 times on the Baltimore waterfront. His hands remembered even though his mind was screaming. He crawled back, paying out cable as he went, until he and Hale were 20 feet from the bunker, crouched in the drainage ditch with 60 feet of steel between them and the support beam. "When I pull," Mason whispered, "the beam comes out. The weight shifts. The roof should collapse inward and down. The machine gun crew will be buried under approximately 3 tons of wet earth." "Should," Hale repeated. "Should," Mason confirmed. "I can't guarantee." "Son, nothing in war is guaranteed except that people die. Let's try to make sure there are the right people for once." Mason wrapped the cable around his hands, feeling the steel bite into his palms. Hale did the same, his good hand gripping tight, despite the blood loss that had turned his whole left side dark and wet. They braced their feet against the side of the ditch. The angle wasn't perfect. Nothing about this was perfect, but it would have to do. "On 3, Mason said. 1, 2. The MG-34 fired again, a long burst that lasted 5 seconds. That was wrong. That was too long. The pattern was breaking down. Maybe they were spooked. Maybe they'd seen the cable. It didn't matter now. This was the moment, the point where all the calculations and instincts either paid off or got them killed. 3! They pulled. Mason threw everything into it. Every ounce of strength built in 5 years of dock work. Every desperate hour of infantry training. Every bit of terror and hope and rage that war had planted in his chest. The cable went taut, sang with tension, and for a horrible moment, nothing happened. The beam held. The structure held. The Germans kept firing, bullets snapping overhead like angry wasps. Then Mason felt it, a shift, a yielding. The beam moved, just an inch, maybe less, but it moved. The ammunition boxes on the roof had done their work, adding just enough weight to change the equation. The wet earth, sodden from 3 days of rain, was heavier than the builders had calculated, and the beam, damaged by time and moisture and the constant vibration of the machine gun firing, finally failed its purpose. It made a sound like a tree breaking in a storm, a crack that rose to a shriek of tearing wood. The right support beam pulled free of its moorings. The left beam, already compromised by rot, snapped under the sudden shift in load, and 3 tons of Normandy earth, held aloft by nothing but hope and German engineering, collapsed. The sound was indescribable. Not quite an explosion, not quite a thunderclap, more like the earth itself groaning as it resettled. Dust and dirt billowed from the bunker's firing slit. The entire structure sagged, compressed, imploded. Mason heard shouting from inside, German voices raised in panic and pain. And then silence. Just silence, broken only by the soft patter of falling dirt. The MG-34 had stopped firing. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, nothing happened. Mason and Hale lay in the ditch, breathing hard, staring at what they'd done. The bunker looked almost the same from the outside. Same earthen mound, same general shape. but the roof had dropped by at least a foot, compressing the interior space. The firing slit was mostly blocked now, filled with dirt and debris, and the gun was silent. Blessedly, mercifully silent. Torres was shouting something from their original position. Mason couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Elation, disbelief, hope. Other voices joined him. Other members of the company who'd been pinned down, who'd been watching their friends die all morning. The bunker was neutralized. The field was open. They could advance. But Mason barely heard them. He was staring at the collapsed bunker, thinking about the men inside. He'd buried them alive. No clean bullet wound, no quick death. Just darkness and crushing weight and suffocation. He tried to tell himself they were enemy soldiers, that they'd killed 11 Americans this morning, that war was war. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "O'Reilly," Hale's voice was weak now, fading. "Good work, son. You saved..." The first mortar round hit 30 feet to their left. The Germans had observation posts. Of course they did. They'd seen the bunker collapse, heard the shouting, and now they were adjusting fire, walking mortar rounds across the field to catch the Americans before they could exploit the opening. Mason heard the distinctive whistle thump of German mortars, heard Torres screaming for everyone to take cover, heard the world dissolve into explosions and flying earth. "Move!" Mason grabbed Hale's good arm, started pulling him toward the hedge line. The sergeant was dead weight now, barely conscious. Blood had turned the drainage ditch water red around him. "Come on, Sarge, we gotta move!" Another mortar round, closer. The blast wave knocked Mason sideways, filled his mouth with dirt. His ears rang. Hale was trying to say something, lips moving, but no sound could penetrate the ringing. Mason pulled harder, dragging the sergeant through the mud, through the blood, toward anything that resembled cover. Torres appeared from nowhere, running across the open field in defiance of every tactical principle they'd ever learned. The Texan grabbed Hale's other arm, and together they hauled him toward the hedge line. Mortar rounds walked after them, like a giant's footsteps, each one closer than the last. Mason's lungs burned. His legs were rubber. 20 feet to cover, 15. The round hit 5 feet behind them. Mason felt himself lifted, thrown forward by the blast. He slammed into the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, tasted blood, couldn't see through the dirt and smoke. His ears were still ringing, but beneath the ringing he could hear Torres cursing steadily, creatively, in Spanish and English. That was good. That meant Torres was alive. He rolled over, coughing, and saw Hale. The sergeant lay on his back, eyes open, mouth working soundlessly. His chest was a mess of shrapnel and blood. Mason crawled to him, knowing it was too late, knowing it even before he reached him. Hale's hand came up, grabbed Mason's jacket with surprising strength, pulled him close. "Worth it," Hale managed. Blood bubbled at his lips. "Field's open. Boys can advance. Sarge, don't..." "You did good." Hale's grip loosened. "Baltimore, tell them we..." He didn't finish. His eyes stayed open, but the light went out of them. Mason found himself staring into that emptiness, unable to look away, unable to process what had just happened. Torres was beside him now, pulling at his arm, saying something about secondary explosions, about needing to move, but Mason couldn't move. Hale had saved his life back in Baltimore. Hale had come out here with him knowing he was already wounded, knowing he might not make it back. And now he was dead because Mason had needed help pulling a goddamn cable. "O'Reilly!" Torres's voice finally penetrated. "He's gone! We gotta move, or we're gonna join him." They moved. Mason let Torres pull him back toward friendly lines, stumbling like a drunk, barely aware of the continuing mortar fire. Other soldiers were advancing now, using the opening Mason had created, pouring through the gap where the MG-34 had been. He heard someone shouting about a German retreat, heard the distant sound of Sherman tanks finally getting unstuck. The battle was moving forward. The line was advancing. Victory of a sort. But Sergeant Hale was dead. They made it back to the company position where medics immediately descended on Torres. The private's leg was worse than he'd let on. Shrapnel from that last mortar round had torn through his calf, probably severed tendons. He'd need evacuation, surgery, maybe lose part of the foot. But he was alive. He was cursing the medics and trying to smoke a cigarette and alive. Mason sat against a hedgerow with his hands in his lap, still covered in mud and blood, and Hale's blood, and the blood of men whose names he'd never learned. Someone handed him water. Someone else tried to give him a cigarette. He took neither. He just sat there, staring at nothing, while the battle moved on without him. An hour later, maybe two, a Lieutenant Mason had never seen before appeared with a clipboard. He asked questions. What happened? How did the bunker get neutralized? Why was Sergeant Hale dead? Mason answered mechanically, explaining about the support beams, the weight, the cable, the collapse. The lieutenant listened, made notes, nodded occasionally. "Good work, Private," the lieutenant said when Mason finished. "That bunker was holding up the entire advance. You opened a corridor that allowed us to push 800 meters today. The colonel will want to hear about this." But Mason knew, even then, that the colonel would never hear the real story. The official report, when it finally came down, would say that the bunker was destroyed by delayed artillery fire. No mention of a dock worker from Baltimore. No mention of support beams or steel cables, or the particular way that wet earth collapses when you remove the right stress point. And definitely no mention of Sergeant Hale, who had died pulling a cable to save men he'd never get to see. Go home. That night, Mason sat in a foxhole and stared at his hands. They still smelled of earth and rot and the particular scent of old wood under stress. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the crack of the support beam breaking, heard the groan of the collapsing roof, heard voices shouting in German as tons of earth buried them alive. He tried to tell himself it was necessary. He tried to feel pride in what he'd accomplished, but all he felt was tired. The advance continued. The company pushed deeper into the bocage, fighting for every hedgerow, every field, every meaningless piece of French farmland that looked exactly like the last piece, and the piece after that. Torres was evacuated to a field hospital and then back to England. Mason heard he'd lost most of his left foot, but would survive. The Texan sent word back through the company grapevine. He'd told the surgeons about the bunker collapse, about Mason's gravity trap, said the story was spreading through the medical units, that other soldiers were asking questions about using similar tactics against fortified positions. But none of it made it into the official reports. None of it reached the training manuals. It stayed where it belonged, in the mud and blood, and whispered stories that soldiers told each other when officers weren't listening. Mason heard later that some other units had tried variations on his technique, collapsing sections of bocage hedgerows onto German positions, undermining bunker foundations, using weight and leverage instead of explosives. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Men died either way. Mason survived Normandy, survived the push to St. Lo, survived the breakout, the race across France, the winter in the Ardennes. He collected no medals, received no commendations beyond the standard campaign ribbons everyone got. When the war finally ended and they shipped him home, he went back to the Baltimore docks and asked for his old job. The foreman, who'd served in the First World War and understood things that didn't need saying, gave it to him without question. For 40 years, Mason loaded cargo at Baltimore's port. He moved crates and containers and pallets with the same careful eye he'd always had, calculating weight and balance and stress points without conscious thought. He married, had 2 children, lived a quiet life. And he never told anyone about the morning in Normandy when he'd turned his warehouse skills into a weapon, when he'd buried men alive, when he'd watched Sergeant Hale die because gravity was more reliable than luck. Once, late in life, a historian doing research on the 30th Infantry Division came to interview him. The historian had heard rumors about an unconventional bunker assault near Cramville, had found references in personal diaries and unit morning reports. He wanted to know if Mason remembered it, if he'd been there, if the stories were true. Mason thought about it for a long moment, thought about Hale's gray face and Torres's shattered leg, and the sound of timber cracking under stress. Thought about 11 bodies in a field, and German voices choking on dirt, and the way war reduced everything to weight and leverage, and who died, so someone else could advance 800 meters. Just another day in the bocage, he'd said finally. Just another day where the ground was soft. The historian had nodded, made a note, moved on to other questions. Mason never brought it up again. The truth stayed where it belonged, in the mud of Normandy, In the silence between officially recorded history, in the space where individual human ingenuity met the grinding machinery of war, and somehow managed to save lives by taking them. The report said artillery, the survivors knew better. But survivors learned early that some things weren't meant for documentation, weren't meant for celebration, weren't meant for anything except the dark hours before dawn, when memory returned unbidden. War doesn't reward the people who think of the right solution at the right time. It only chooses who survives long enough to carry the weight of what they've done. And every time a bunker collapsed, only a few people knew the real cost. A sergeant who died covering a dock worker who'd seen what maps couldn't show, that sometimes the weakest point in any structure is the one holding everything else up, and sometimes the only way forward is to bring the whole thing down, consequences and guilt and all, and hope something better rises from the rubble. But mostly it doesn't. Mostly you just end up with more rubble, more names forgotten in official reports, more men who did what needed doing and got nothing for it but nightmares, and the knowledge that they'd survived when better people hadn't. Mason O'Reilly died in 1994, took that knowledge with him, and left nothing behind but a dock worker's legacy, that every structure has a breaking point, that weight always wins eventually, and that the men who understand this truth are cursed to see it everywhere, in bridges and buildings and bunkers, and in the careful way we stack our memories, hoping the whole thing holds together long enough to matter. It rarely does.